Creating a 10-second text timer in Unity. So in this video, I'm going to walk through creating a text game object, creating a scripting component for that text game object, and then creating code within that scripting component to keep track of time using Time.deltaTime, the property delta time of the object time, to keep track of the time between frames. So this is the time in-game as tracked by Unity, the time between rendering frames and keeping track of that total time. We will then use that time information to change the value of the text object's text property and update that on the screen. So let's get started. I have here an empty project within Unity. I want a text overlay, some text information. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new text game object. I can do that using the plus dropdown, or I can right click and go to UI text, or again, drop down UI text. So creating a new text game object automatically creates a canvas game object for the text to be displayed on because it's part of the user interface UI collection of game objects. It also creates an event system game object in case we want to do things like click on this user interface or do other types of events. So automatically by creating it, notice it's already selected within the hierarchy view and over here within the inspector view as well. So I'm going to go ahead and do things a little bit quickly, but using these various tools, I'm going to navigate around a little bit using the hand tool here. I'm right clicking to just drag this around. I'm left clicking right here, rectangle tools to select this. I'm going to make this bigger right here, drag this out, drag this down just a little bit like this, move this up, adjust this just a little bit, change its rotation that I accidentally changed back to 0 and 0 and OK. So what I want then is I want to make this text significantly bigger. So with the text object selected in the hierarchy view, I'm going to come over to inspector view, come down here to font size, which is currently set to 14. I'm going to make this significantly bigger, set this to 64, press enter. And then I'm going to go ahead and change this from new text, its current value of the text property, to timer colon, and then a space. Now, if I move over to the game preview right here in the middle, from scene to game preview, we see timer and a colon. Well, that's okay, but I'm going to scroll out a little bit using my scroll wheel, left click using the rectangle tool, and move this up here. I want it kind of upper in the corner. And double checking game. Yeah, that's roughly where I want it. That looks good. And change my Z rotation that actually accidentally gets set back to 0. So we're flat here. So I accidentally changed my rotation, so I changed it back to 0, 0, and 0. So over here in scene, we notice we dragged it up here. Game, it's right up here. So that's all set. Now I want to get the current time and then the time between the last frames. So as determined by Unity, the exact time sort of in game. So to do all that, I'm going to need a scripting component. So with the text game object selected in the hierarchy view, I'm going to come over to the inspector view because I want to add a new component. Come down to add component at the bottom, scroll to the bottom of the list to new script, click on this. And currently it's selected over here in search. So if I press down arrow twice or sometimes the right arrow twice to move it out of search and into the name area, I can change this. I want to change this to timer. So we're naming the script over what it does and clicking on create and add. So create and add is going to add a new scripting component to this game object. There it goes, and it's updated. So under the inspector view right here, there's a new component called timer. It is a script, notice in parentheses, and it's associated with a file. File it's associated with is called timer, and timer was added over here as a C# file. Notice the sharp symbol in the project view. So double clicking on the file timer created just moments ago will bring up Visual Studio and load the project. So give it just a moment to load everything. And then we have, okay, our timer class we can use. Now, we want to be working with a user interface element or a user interface game object. By default, Unity does not load in any of the data types of the user interface. So we need to basically tell it to do that. So under the using right here, all of these right here to here, end of line 3, I'm going to put a space, and I need to tell this code to go ahead and load all of the user interface data types because we want to be working with a text game object, and that data type's not loaded automatically. So we want to say, okay, using Unity engine. So I'm selecting this based on what it was guessed here. So Unity engine, and then a period. And what do I want? I want UI, and then a semicolon. So we want everything in Unity engine plus the namespace for user interface right here. And it says, okay, this will add all of the data types of user interfaces for us to use. Now, why is this important? Well, because we want to update the text property of a text game object. The text game object is a data type that's in the UI, so not automatically loaded. So what do we want to do? Well, we want to get the current time, and then we want to update a text game object's text property. So it sounds like we need two different values. So when we're talking about objects, and C# is based on objects, an object as a review is a collection of values. Each individual value is called a property. So if we want two different values as part of this object, it sounds like we actually want two different properties. One to keep track of time and one to keep track of text. So if we're creating properties in an object, we create the properties outside of any other methods. And again, a method is just a function that's part of an object. So start and update are methods, but if we want properties, we want to create them outside of any one method. So I'm going to go ahead and add some extra lines after the opening curly brackets, and I'm going to create two properties that we will use across the methods start and update. So creating some properties. The first thing I want to create is I want to keep track of time. Now I already know that Time.deltaTime, which is a property we're about to use, returns a value of a float, which is a type of data type of a decimal number, where the decimal can float around in a number. So I already know that, so I want to create a float data type. I'm going to call this variable timer, and I'm going to set it to an initial value of 0f. The f indicates that this is a float value, a decimal value, float within C#. So we're going to create it and set its initial value to 0, because the time initially would be 0. Now, we also are going to be working with a text game object because we want to update its text property. So we went through all of the work of adding Unity Engine UI just so we could do this. Text, and notice it shows up, and the class right under the dropdown is unityengine.ui.text. So that's why we went through that extra work. So I'm going to call this timer text, call it exactly what it is. And right now, I'm just going to put a semicolon after it. So this is just going to create the property, but it doesn't currently have a value. So down here in the start method, what I want to happen is as soon as everything starts up, I want this scripting component to talk to the game object it is associated with, get its text component, and then we're going to update from there. So two things want to start right off, right? So timer text right here is equal to what? Game object, lowercase g. So the game object the scripting component is associated with. Then we're going to use its method called getComponent. And we're going to use the less than and greater than signs right here because we want to get a component by its type. So what are we getting? Getting text matching the type of the variable. And this is a method, so open and closing parentheses to close it. So what's happening here? We're saying, okay, I'm a scripting component. I want to talk to the game object I'm associated with. I will use its method getComponent. Then I want to get a component by its type here called text. And then after this, timer text will be set to, or connected to if you prefer, the text component of the game object this scripting component is also associated with, which is to say we're going from a script component to a game object to a text component. So, okay, our timer is set to 0f, so our timer starts at 0, and our timer text is set to the component that this scripting component is also a part of. So that game component. So okay, our start is off to a good start. So what we want to happen is anytime a frame is rendered, so notice in this comment, update is called once per frame. So anytime a frame happens, what we want to happen is we want to update our timer, and then we want based on that value, to update our text. So let's start then by updating our timer. So our timer starts at 0, and then every single time update method is called, we want to update the value. So timer is plus equals, so timer plus the existing value of timer plus some other thing. So timer equals timer plus something, condensed in the shorthand of plus equals. What is it equal to? Well, we're going to use something called time. Notice unityengine.time, the interface to get time information from Unity, dot, and then we're going to use something called delta-time. So delta-time here, supplied by the IntelliSense IntelliCode thing, says the completion time in seconds since the last frame. And that's what we want. Why do we want that? Because we want to know, according to Unity, how much time it took between rendering. So it's rendering frames, rendering frames, rendering frames, rendering frames. And then it's calculating the time between those, which could be like nanoseconds or milliseconds. It's usually a very small number in between each time it is rendering. So we want to just count all of those times because that will be the actual in-game time according to Unity. So we're starting with 0f, 0 for the float. Every single frame we are updating based on the nanoseconds and milliseconds that have been running in the game every time we run it, which again are tiny, tiny fractions of time, like nanoseconds to milliseconds. But we're just going to keep track of those because it will eventually build up to a full second. So the next thing we want to do, now that we've got this information, is we want to update our text. So we can do that by using timer text to access the text component and then access its text property. So text right here, set it equal to, what do we want? We want timer :space, the existing value, plus the existing value of timer right here, semicolon. So every single frame, we're getting that delta time, that tiny slices of time between frames, like milliseconds and nanoseconds. And those will count up to the total time that the game has been running in Unity. Then we're going to take that information and update our string value, the text property of the text component. So let's save this file and kind of look at what I was talking about. So I'm going to save this file in Windows, Control S, or could have also gone to File, Save Asset. Notice Control S right here. And if you were on Mac, Command S would do the same thing. So let's go back to Unity. Give it just a second to load what changes I just made. And timer is still up here, timer :, and if we select text, we come over here. Now, I was talking about the text component. Notice in the inspector view, text component, and its text property, this right here. So we move from down here, the scripting component, to the game object, back over here to the text component and get its text property timer. Now, let's run this to see what's actually happening. Go ahead and click play. Give it just a second to load. And then notice we're getting timer : and then seconds, and then all of this extra information right here. The milliseconds, right? The slices of time between frames, milliseconds and nanoseconds that are happening. And for a timer, that's kind of ugly. All we really care about as like a player is the seconds. We don't really care about the nanoseconds or the milliseconds. So the information we want then is this right here, right? Before the decimal. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this. And everything so far is kind of working, but we kind of just want it to round. We don't actually care about that extra information. So let's move back to Visual Studio Code and close this out by rounding the resulting number. So right here, before it's displayed, right here, we want to round this number. Not during the calculation, because we want the calculation to be right, but right before it's displayed, let's go ahead and round it. So C# has built in mathematical functions, and one of which is called round, which does more or less what its name implies. It rounds a number up to the latest integer value, so then the single number value instead of a decimal. But we are working with floats, and just like we used f up here on line 8 to indicate a float number, we're going to call math f for float. And then what do we want? We want round right here, and we're going to put it in parentheses right here. And if I put the cursor over round, we see returns f rounded to the nearest integer. Notice it returns a float. So we're using math f for float values, and round rounds to the nearest integer. So let's save this. For me, Control S, or of course also File Save Asset. So we are doing the calculation right here on line 20, keeping track of every single frame every time we do it in nanoseconds and that milliseconds. And then right here, we're going to round it up to an actual second because we want to keep track of that information, but we want to show it in the rounded form. So moving back over here to Unity, we can see if we now run the scene, we should see timer 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Notice we're now rounding the exact time in seconds, rounded to the nearest integer, nearest whole number, but we still are saving that information internally just in case we need it for something. So to stop this then, and review what I've done in this video, we've created a new text game object right here. It's the first thing I did. I moved it around. I resized it by working with its font size. I changed its initial text value right here for the text property and just moved around and arranged everything. Double checked over here in game. It was where I wanted it. I accidentally messed with its rotation, so I fixed that by putting the zeros back in. Then we added a new scripting component. So we selected text over here in the hierarchy view, over here in the inspector view, came down and went to add component, new script, created it. We called it timer, describing what it does. It created a new C# file under the project view over here. We double clicked on it to open it up in Visual Studio. Then after talking through it, we realized we actually needed two properties, so two values within the object. The first of which is timer, which we set to an initial value of 0. So 0f, f has a float value in this case. Then we realized that we wanted to talk to a text game object, which meant we needed the UI. I did this first because I anticipated this need, but had we not done this, to show you what that looks like, notice it gets real confused. It says, I don't know what this means. Well, what it's missing is using Unity Engine UI and save the file. So I anticipated that need and we went ahead and added it back in, and we can verify that by putting the cursor over text and seeing it's unityengine.ui.text. So adding the unityengine.ui also added the text for us. We created the initial value right here. Then in the start method, we use the game object property and its get component method to get a component by its type, text. So text timer is equal to the text component associated with the game object right here, lowercase g. Then in the update method, which is called every single frame, we updated this using Time.deltaTime. Time is provided by Unity Engine, so Unity Engine.time, and delta time is the time between frames. That there's milliseconds and nanoseconds between each time it renders something back to back to back to back to back. Then we took that right down here. We used mathf for float and used its round method. We rounded the result of this from a float value, which was like 0 point something something something, into an integer value. Then we updated the text property of the timer text object right here that we have. And finally, when we ran it, we saw we got timer, the value we wanted, and it would keep track of the seconds for us.